once again, welcome to everyone. The first thing I'd like to do is to just type in the chat box the link to our website, where we already have posted the schedule, the slides from yesterday, as well as the recording. So feel free to access them. And what we're going to do today is we're also going to, after today's session, we're also going to post the recording as well as the slides from Tony and also from Ben. No? As you know, day 2 is focused on the application of critical realism in specific disciplines. No? So at this point, I'm going to turn over the virtual floor to Ben, who will be our moderator for today. So Ben?
Thank you, Father Johnny, and welcome to our participants. So yesterday, we got a nice opportunity to review some of the fundamentals of critical realism, but we also had quite an advanced discussion on meta-reality. So that was a bit mind-bending for me, but I really enjoyed that. So now we go more on the applied side. And it helps that we can just draw on the concepts we discussed yesterday, but now bring it to the level of actual applied research. So for our first, by the way, as usual, feel free to post your comments, insights, or even questions as the presentation is going on. And then we'll draw from the chat during the open forum. Because when we view our recording, we will also see your chat questions. Okay, so as already mentioned by Father Johnny, Tony is presenting her research on educational systems, and then I will also be presenting on action research in management. So Tony, can we test your sharing of your presentation, and then I will give you the floor.
Yes, I come from the north, and now we have tropical temperatures, and we have 30 centigrades.
Oh.
So we are suffering a bit from the heat, but I think I can do this anyway. I wanted to start by mentioning some of the basic works which are informative to find out about Margaret Archer's theoretical work on and empirical work on state educational systems. And these are really classics. I mean, Roy Bhaskar and Margaret Archer are contemporaries in the sense that their major works were published the same year in 1979. Roy Bhaskar's The Possibility of Naturalism was published in 1979, and Margaret Archer's Social Origins of Educational Systems was published the same year. And what's very stunning is that they didn't know each other, and they were addressing the same problems in the social sciences. So when Margaret Archer found out about Roy Bhaskar, which was in the 1980s, she thought that he had actually solved the problems in philosophy the same problems that she had tried to solve in sociology. And so she sort of embraced critical realism from then on. But it's strange to think that they were actually working on the same types of problems. The fact that there is something called emergence both in natural and social life, and that was a counter argument against methodological individualism, which was the dominant school of thought at the time, and that was coupled with positivism. But the thing is that Margaret Archer's book from 1979, which was republished in 2013, it's a very big work. It contains 815 pages. So it's a sort of big job to get through it. And for those who are interested in finding out about Archer's work and actually to understand her morphogenetic approach, which I'm sure you all know about, it's my advice to go to the shortened version, the college edition. the college edition of Social Origins of Educational Systems. That is a much more accessible book. It's much shorter, and it's dealing only with 2 of the countries that she was studying in her first book. It's dealing with France and England. So for those who are really interested in understanding her, the book which came in 1995, Really Social Theory, the Morphogenetic Approach, my advice would be that you should read her actual study of educational systems, because that is a theoretical presentation of the framework for that empirical study. And unless you have read the empirical study, it's very hard to understand all her theoretical concepts. Well, that was just a sort of study advice. The thing is that in the 1970s, the intellectual climate was very favorable of positivism. And at the same time, there was a lot of struggle against it. And if you read the foreword, or maybe it's called introduction, Margaret Archie writes in the 2013 edition of her Social Origins, she writes that her book from 79 was a howl of protest against the theoretical options for social scientists at the time, because that was only methodological individualism and methodological holism. And well, the first one was insisting that only individuals can cause social change, while the other one was that systems change themselves. They are disregarding the social agent altogether. So the sort of hallmark of Archie's approach at that time was that she wanted to consider both structure and agency. Both are important to explain social change. And actually she was, by studying social change, she was addressing a major lack in the theory of sociology at the time. And a criticism was that they could not explain social change, especially not Talcott Parsons, the American who was the dominant figure at the time, because they were only talking about the equilibrium of systems returning to their stable state and so on. So explaining social change was really the major challenge in social science at this time. Was this right? Yeah, they didn't know each other. That was one main point. And they not only didn't they know each other, but they didn't know each other's work. So that was sort of surprising. But it was obviously a response to a problem, an intellectual problem of the times, both their suggestions in philosophy and in sociology. Yeah, the reason why Margaret Archie was so happy about the possibility of naturalism was that Roy introduced the notion of emergence, the stratified nature of social reality, that structure and agency have different properties and powers. And so she's actually written, Roy told me once that she has written about Roy's book, The Possibility of Naturalism, that it was the major work in the 20th century. So she had a very high estimation of his contribution. So that's why they joined forces, and both were members of the International Association for Critical Realism for all the years since it started. And I mean, Margaret always made a point to attend all the conferences and to support the the work of the association. Now, the thing is that sometimes Margaret Archer and Roy Bhaskar are seen as representing different versions of critical realism, and I don't actually think that is quite true. So this is one of the reasons why I wrote this article about real definition, pointing out that Archer's definition of educational systems is a real definition. The real definitions is sort of the central focus of Roy's description of scientific theories. He says that the basic challenge in all scientific investigations is to establish real definitions of existing social natural entities. In real definitions refer to something about the entity that explains how it behaves, its causal powers and tendential behavior. And for those who are interested in going more deeply into real definitions and how this may be applied to social science, I recommend Ruth Groff's works. She has written about the power, the perception of causality as powers, the exertion of powers, the tendencies of things. I mean, she's giving a background of the philosophical debate, which sort of fights out the Humeans who consider conjunction of events as causality, and those who consider the tendencies of things as causalities. And to consider, I mean, educational systems as things with tendencies, I mean, it's a real revolution in educational sociology. No one else has done that. Archer's definition of the educational system, you can see here, I've written it, a nationwide and differentiated collection of institutions devoted to formal education, whose overall control and supervision is at least partly governmental, and whose components and processes are related to one another. The two major aspects are the connection to the state and the systemic form. Now, it's very important to remember that the system is connected to the state. And I think that is the case in most countries of the world now. It didn't used to be in former times. The education was connected to the church, for instance, in medieval Europe. And it also has had sort of private, there have been private institutions. The guilds had educational institutions. So the achievement of the state obtaining control of education in Europe was Napoleon who did that for the first time. And but I think nowadays, you know, at least the research I've read about, for instance, Asian countries, I mean, all the educational systems have some kind of connection to the state. So the state is involved in education. It's inconceivable to think of education as not having anything to do with the state, being completely decentralized, you know. Man, we could discuss that, I suppose. But the system is also related to its environment, to multiple social institutions. So the thing is that the relationship between education and state tends to produce a kind of processes in the system.
Excuse me, Tony.
Yes.
Your voice is becoming soft somehow. Did something change? The distance to your mic, maybe?
Could you repeat that?
We couldn't hear you earlier, but now we can. Please proceed.
Okay. Yeah, these are the structures and mechanisms that are produced by relationship to the state. The unification and systematization are the processes which are produced by the connection to the state. I think intuitively you can, in a way, understand that the state is always interested in having a system that functions. They would like everything to be the same way all over the country. They don't like a lot of local varieties because that's problematic to administer. And they don't like bottlenecks in the system. And Archer showed this through her empirical studies, that this is the case. When the state takes over, unification and systematization are the dominant, are the processes steered by the state. And the relationship with the environment produces specialization. The thing is, if an enterprise wants something from education, they want something for themselves. They want specialized qualifications. So that tends to disrupt the unification and the systematization of the system which the state wants. So there is a potential conflict there between the connection to the state and the connection to the environment. Also the educational system, the state educational system is connected to numerous social institutions. So in order to meet these requirements from different types of social institutions, they have to devise a curriculum that can be a sort of common currency between them. So this means that you get some kind of school knowledge, you know, that can satisfy everybody. You can't be too particular in satisfying one sector of society if you actually rely on all the different sectors. If you have taken on to satisfy the demands and requirements of the different sectors. So you see that intensive unification has two aspects. Intensive unification, it means that the central policy gets through everywhere. You are able to carry out your state policy effectively. And extensive unification means that all localities are alike. There's uniformity. So these are the processes that predominate, as we shall later see in centralized systems. Mechanisms of unification and systematization, and mechanisms of differentiation and specialization. That is the connection to the environment. Differentiation means that the system is relatively autonomous. I mean, it's a sociological definition of differentiation. Differentiation means, you know, to be distinct. And that is a requirement for being autonomous. You don't rely on any one institution, but you have a relationship with everybody. So then you obtain some kind of autonomy. And specialization, I mentioned that, these two mechanisms. So Archer says she defines centralized and decentralized systems by saying that in centralized educational system, the state is the leading part. Policy based on educational demands from social groups are negotiated at the political center and implemented top down. In centralized systems, processes of unification and systematization dominate. caused by the structural relations to the state, which prefers uniformity and systematization and against bottlenecks. But decentralized systems have no leading part. Changes are initiated in various places in the system, spreading horizontally, thus often interfering with state policy. And processes of specialization and differentiation predominate, primarily because external transactions, tailor-made provisions, may be sanctioned by external groups, transacted by external groups. So here are the diagrams that Arthur has drawn, which I succeeded in drawing myself in my new system, my program here. Can you see the figure?
Yep.
Hello, are you there?
Yes, we can.
You can see the figure. I think these are really genius, these figures. You know, the centralized system, you see how there is aggregation of demands, which are voiced by external interest groups to the central government, and by teaching profession also to the central government. They are negotiated, political manipulation. Well, it's not negatively meant, actually, it's sort of, it means the craft of politics. You know, they are, finding out what kind of reforms they will implement, and then the central government implements it into educational change. There is very little interference in the process of implementation in a centralized system. While in a decentralized system, you can see it's entirely different. Here, you have interference with implementation because interest groups, they get their own education programs and educational institutions, and these may not be in line with government policy. So educational change is not so effective in decentralized systems. And the reason why maybe I'm so fascinated by this figure of interaction in centralized system is that I think this is the Norwegian system. I think we have a centralized educational system. And however, I mean, a lot of Norwegian researchers talk about the Norwegian system as decentralized. And that is a sort of political, what should I call it? It's more acceptable to the public to have a decentralized system. Everybody likes to have a decentralized system. The politicians, every time they take over government, they say, now we're going to make a decentralized system. But it never happens. But, somehow they manage to describe it as decentralized because they don't know about Arthur's definition, obviously. And that is, yes, this is the definition of decentralization voiced by international agencies. It's not just in Norway that it's very popular to say that we are going to decentralize the system now. Also the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the OECD, they say, oh, you should all make decentralized systems because then the local people can have their say on what education should be like. So they have advocated decentralization, privatization, and community financing of education. And they have made this a condition for financial assistance in the structural adjustment policy, which was current since the 1980s. I think it's probably could be still there, but I don't know about that. But it was at least a requirement for for getting money or getting support from the international agencies. And how do these agencies conceive of educational decentralization when they demand that countries should introduce that in return for funding? They say it's the delegation of decision-making authority from the center to the periphery. So they are only talking about this line of decision-making, that, you should, enable the local units to make more decisions about how to do things, the curriculum or teacher salaries and so on. This definition does not include the structures and mechanisms of the system, which precludes finding out whether the system prior to reforms is centralized or decentralized. So educational decentralization has proved difficult to implement. That's reported in a lot of the research. And a possible explanation could be that central policy is more effectively implemented in centralized systems. But then we don't know what the system is like because nobody has studied that. Now, you could, for a criticism of Archer's study could be that it is based on European countries. Originally, so she studied England, France, Russia, and Denmark. And she writes in her book from '79 that these countries are chosen for their diversity, their educational systems, educational history, national history, culture, and social structure differed. Well, of course, it's in European context, they were different. But at the same time, none of these countries had been subjected to conquest, colonization, or the imposition of a foreign educational system. Their different forms of national education developed in response to internal pressures. So Archer actually makes a proviso to her theory. She says that it's not made, well, it's not addressing, or it's not based on studies of countries that have been colonized or been conquered. So, however, currently state educational systems connected to the state and with systemic interconnectivity exist in a majority of countries in the world. And of course, how this came about, that is one story. And no, I don't know anybody has actually told it. Maybe somebody has told it for some countries. But that the fact that this is not the case makes Archer's conception of educational systems widely applicable, in my view. And that also, of course, open to further elaborations and modifications. Of course, it has, for instance, if you see these figures here, people will say, oh, what's the input to central government? How about these international funding organizations? Don't they have influence on central government? Probably they do. So I think that these figures can be developed, but this basic figure of having, for instance, in the centralized systems, this implementation, which is not significantly interfered with, and the fact that the central government is getting input from interest groups and from the profession. I think these are sort of basic insights that Archer has managed to give us. Okay, that was it.
Thank you so much, Tony.
Yeah.
I especially appreciated the background story on Archer and Bhaskar's discovering each other. And yes, I did try to work through the books of Archer, and they are challenging because of the depth of the concept and of course the terminologies used. So I appreciate your friendly introduction and as to how this applies to educational systems.
I'll tell you why. Because I'm so keen that people should study Archer theory. I think it's really good.
Yes, I made
I
sure
think
we have it in our
I want to
library.
encourage people to do that.
Yes, I am very encouraged. Now we will open the forum for questions. Now, of course, this is social research that looks at levels of systems, of policies, of interest groups. And this is a very high level type of analysis. So Tony is here to walk us through some of the challenges of these types of analysis. But I would agree with her that Archer and Bhaskar gives us plenty of tools to do these kinds of analysis. So who would like to pose the first question? I think I'm also checking the chat.
Ben, hi.
Yes,
I actually have a
Father
question
Johnny.
for
Yes,
Tony.
go ahead.
Yeah. So Tony, thank you for your presentation. It's always very lucid, and it's always good to see how Archer has been able to do her empirical research using the concepts of critical realism, including her own. No? So my question for you is really more synthetic, Tony. Having worked with Archer's model, in your own work as well, your analysis of the Norwegian educational system, what would you say is the main benefit or difference that critical realism, particularly Archer's concepts, have brought to your research? This is for us who are just beginning to do research using critical realism. What do you think is the main benefit or the main game changer that happens when we use the concepts from critical realism, especially from Archer?
Well, yeah, actually, I think that Margaret Archer, she's actually considered. Some people think that she's a conservative, in education, but she's basically a sociologist, which means that she's not afraid of talking about people's interests, group interests, that people, are keen to control education. Groups are keen to control education.
Tony, I'm sorry, but your voice is getting muffled. Can you maybe move towards your microphone? Yeah, there.
Yeah. Can you hear now?
Yes, much
Can
clearer.
you hear me better now?
Yes, much better.
Okay. Yes, she's not afraid to talk about group interests. She's, for instance, saying that she's never observed any government who has voluntarily stepped down from controlling education. She's never seen a centralized system becoming decentralized because it's such an important political asset to control education. For any government, they may have the ambition to decentralize education before they enter government. But once they have access to offices, they will centralize. They will aim to control education, that there is a struggle to control education. I think that is a very sort of brave move to acknowledge that people have an interest in controlling education. And not everybody's willing to say that, because it's controversial in civil society. If you say about a political party, you're aiming to control education, aren't you? Oh, no, we just want everybody to have a good life and to give the best education possible to everybody and so on. But this is the special perspective of a sociologist. It's not one should not be afraid of seeing that there are some so-called vested interests. That's a concept from Max Weber. Vested interest. You're interested in maintaining the position that you have. You're not interested in losing the benefits that you have. You're struggling to maintain.
Thank you. That's, for some of us, that's more depressing than you can ever imagine.
And Tony, maybe
I'm sorry. But be realistic. Touch ground. You don't have to say it the way I said it right now. You can wrap it up a bit more, but you should realize that this is a possible truth.
So do you think, Tony, that Archer's alignment with critical realist principles makes her more astute or more sensitive to the role of interest groups in society that others seem not to pay attention to or
No,
talk about in public?
No, I think it's well, it's a sociologist. It's actually a professional skill, you know. I mean, if you read the classics, if you read Max Weber, even Max Weber, who's not the most radical sociologist, he will say that, you know, there are interest groups in society. People are fighting for their interests.
Indeed. Yes. I'm also a sociologist by background, but I hear a lot of modern sociologists who almost do not comment on interest, well, at least those covering economic sociology, who don't comment as much on power and interest groups as much as I think they should. So kudos to Archer for speaking up. I'm checking the chat if we have additional questions. Oh, there is one from Gilsu. Gilsu, would you like to speak to your question here? Are you able to unmute?
Yeah. Thanks very much for your interesting introduction. I just put a question there on the chat box. Interesting to hear about your comment on decentralization, but I think as we see the existence of World Bank, IMF, and OECD, and many other international organizations, I think that existence itself clearly proves there is strong centralization going on. And to be more specific, I would call it the Europeanization or Americanization. What do you think?
That decentralization is Americanization?
No, that's a centralization.
That centralization is Americanization?
Well, what I'm saying is through the organizations like World Bank and IMF,
yes,
and OECD, they are the organizations to centralize the whatever is around in every country to centralize in a global scale, I'm saying.
No, but if you look at their policies and policy advice, they advise decentralization. But if you must look more closely at what they mean by decentralization. So it's not necessarily what Archer means by decentralization. But the word decentralization is politically, current. It's positively regarded. OECD advocates school autonomy, which means marketization.
That's right.
School autonomy.
Yeah, well, basically I am agreeing with you, but what I'm saying is, although they use the words like decentralization, autonomy, at the end, they pull back to the central policies, nationally and also internationally. That's what that's what I understood, at least in terms of your comment on the domestic situation. But I suppose we can extend to the global situation. I'm not sure whether I'm making myself clear.
Gilsu.
Yeah.
Yeah, if I may. Yeah, go ahead, Tony.
No, maybe you mean that all the advice you get or the imposed policies that you receive increase centralization. That's possible. That's an empirical question. Yes, it's possible. You're right, but that's an empirical question. You can find out by doing research, can't you? But if you look at what they say, the advice, the policy recommendations they make and so forth, they call it decentralization.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what I'm agreeing with you. So although, say, for example, through structural adjustment programs, it seems they are giving the options to the specific country going through structural adjustment, for example. But
Mm.
at the end, what IMF wants to do is actually to have every country struggling, well, whichever country it is, to be in line with what the IMF wants, and kind of bringing them to the global expectation, or but to be more specific, that's a Western-centric policies, other nations are supposed to abide by.
Probably. You know better than I do.
Gilsu, have you had a chance to read Truong's treatise on East Asia? She's a critical realist writing on geopolitics. And
No.
what I'm getting from Gilsu is that he's pointing out a paradox in the policy advocacies of multilaterals and OECD to decentralize, and yet their very process of achieving this is marked by centralization. Did I get that right, Gilsu?
That's exactly the case.
Yes. Again, this is something that some people don't want to speak about in public, but I think it is plain to see it is an empirical fact. More follow-up, Gilsu?
Yeah, I think in a way, whatever is happening in educational research, I am saying it actually, educational matters in a particular country, that the similar mechanism is actually taking place within many other sectors in each country, but also we can extend whatever happens in a particular nation to the global picture, if you like. So whether we are talking about, say, pandemic or health systems, the disease control, educational system, or financial system for that matter, whatever it is, you are really right. It's really difficult for those organizations to specify, the structures or structural kind of control going on at the back of the scene, but they would not say so. But they speak through the policies, and it appears to be the case that it actually benefits and it actually does something good for the struggling nations. But in fact, that is not the case, and it actually ends up, the benefit ends up coming back to those, say, key members of, say, OECD countries, and particularly G7, etc., etc.
Yeah, thank you for the comment, Gilsu. Another reference that would be interesting is Varoufakis, who was the academic who became finance minister of Greece. And he wrote his memoirs on his dealings with IMF and the European Bank as to how they would maneuver, according to him, to reflect the interests of the major European powers, even as they seem to want to help Greece, who went bankrupt several times, if we will remember. I think that was an interesting question by Gilsu. I did not think about the geopolitical implications of Archer's research, but that is an interesting point. I'm now looking at the chat if we have other questions. And I'm not seeing a hand either. I have a question for Tony. In the diagram you cited, I was very interested in your clarification of the concept of political manipulation as used by Archer. Now, from your clarification, I took it to mean how members of a system will use or gain political power to influence the system, right? Social system. Is that what Archer means?
How the parties negotiate their interests. I mean, they use a lot of various means to promote their political interests.
Yes. Well, this is more of a linguistic point. Isn't manipulation an unfortunate use of terminology, given that that's what is meant? Isn't negotiation more descriptive?
Yes, I think it's more descriptive. The thing is, I reacted against it because when I first read it the first time, I thought, wow, that's really, accusing politicians of being immoral or, you know, but then one of Archer's students explained to me that you can see it as a political skill.
Yes.
They are exercising their political skills. And, you know, sometimes it may be a bit sort of gray zone there, that what's ethically right and ethically wrong. But they increasingly use the mass media too. So there has been a development. And I think you could probably bring that up with Margaret Archer. It would be interesting to hear what she had to say about that.
Yes, I'd be interested too. Reading Archer is always an exercise in expanding vocabulary, I think. She has very richly descriptive language, which normally I'm able to follow, but this use of manipulation is a bit striking. There's a comment from Juan Alberto Mercado. Juan Alberto, would you like to speak to your comment here about the irony of decentralization?
Hello.
While following the logic of market competition. Go ahead, you have the floor.
Yeah, what's interesting about what was shown earlier is about the system being centralized with the idea of it flowing in a more, say, with less resistance if it is indeed centralized from a central government flowing down to an educational system, well, which starts flowing up with information and interactions from external groups and say the educational community itself. I mean, those two arrows going up, which goes to central government. But the whole idea of decentralization, particularly here in the Philippines, as it was established, and as Tony said earlier, yeah, a lot of even the SAPs that keep saying, yeah, decentralization is good, because it makes people feel that they're more in control, that they actually have power with regards to charting their own destinies. But one of the fundamental things about decentralization is its relation to the theories of public economics, and the way that in public economics, the orthodox type anyway, they basically start looking at, say, local governors. Instead of being mayors, they're called city managers. So basically, they're meant to behave in a competitive manner, and their competition it's a competition for the best kinds of citizens, such that the idea is that when we give these guys autonomies, they will basically behave in the same way as any other competitive entity in the market. And in that sense, it's as if that ironically, the whole idea of decentralization is to be able to incorporate you into that central market system, which basically just keeps things, well, now we have, when we think about the market systems, we're talking about food, and then the old, before these, we now have privatized public services. So what's stopping this to becoming part and parcel of that, actually, ironically, a central market framework by which logic defines the structure of how these things can be delivered. So that's just, I guess, a pretty convoluted way to look at it, that you decentralize in order to become part of that other central thing, which is overall market competition, and such that everything becomes encapsulated in that kind of structural logic. Thank you.
Tony, did you care to comment about that?
No, I think I have little knowledge of what's happening in other countries of the world, really. So I think you're probably right in your observations.
Well, I think what Juan Alberto points out is the powerful role of discourse and institutional logic in shaping the very social realities that are being addressed, right, Juan Alberto? So, which I think is one of the gifts of critical realism, that the critical component says, let's think about how we are thinking about this thing, because the way we are thinking about it will potentially shape the reality that we're trying to address. And indeed, market logic or market discourse is the dominant discourse. And that's why even in economics, where there are a few active critical realists like Lawson and others, they are trying to fight the hegemony of market logic, even in public economics. And well, without much success, I must say. But they're valiant. They're there. But the neoliberals have a long lead time. So those who want to present alternatives have to work extra hard, because discourse is very difficult to replace because it becomes culturally entrenched. So you have to have, I suppose, just like Archer is saying, interest groups can negotiate so that the discourse can be expanded. Thanks for bringing that up. Juan Alberto, you had a follow-up point, I believe.
Yeah, just in that, a follow-up to that. Yeah, particularly with economics, this is one thing that's, I guess, since you brought up Tony Lawson, and he has a very long history and a long bibliography of stuff to say about orthodox neoclassical economics. And Varoufakis actually wrote something with Ansberger, which is a very good one, very short article about that, that says basically the whole idea of orthodox economics as we know it is about a universality, that it is something natural, that it is something that we can't do about, but the way they look at it with methodological individualism and equilibration makes it what it is. But what I'm saying with regards to the whole education and the decentralization of local governments, at least the way it's done here, is that it feels like instead of decentralizing it and giving people actual more power, what it does is enfold you in another system where there is a different kind of power dynamic, and that is the market system. So thank you.
Yes, we have more and more top companies in the Philippines buying out schools, precisely because this is part of the global supply chain that is now engulfing our educational system. I had a question for Tony, because she said...
Ben, excuse me.
Yes,
Ben, excuse me. Catherine,
there's a question, yes.
Yeah, Catherine is raising her hand.
Yes, I missed that. Catherine, you have the floor.
There it is. Thank you very much. I just wanted to say two things. Firstly, that looking at marketisation of the education system, at the moment there's a beautiful case study playing out in New South Wales, in the state in which I live, but around Australia, of the impacts on schools of this pervasive ideology of schools being businesses, and what that has done to the way that parents and teachers interact, the accountability constraints on teachers and the amount of extra workload that's been put on them. And akin to that, at the same time, which resonates very closely with what Tone has said about Margaret Archer's work, the way that policies around syllabus and curriculum changes with government, and the way that the so-called, what we call culture wars, so the sort of left versus right, and the so-called control of the school curriculum by the left or the right, plays out in elections, plays out in the media, like that connection between political manipulation and the marketisation of, and the way that that's changing education means that we now have massive industrial action, because teachers are so demoralised and leaving the school system so quickly that we don't have teachers. Like the system is on the point of collapse because these two things are not sustainable and not nourishing of schools, ultimately, would be my reading of it. But the thing I wanted to say earlier is that if we're thinking about what critical realism enables, in my work, and I would say it also on behalf of Margaret, Maggie, I would probably say this as well as an interpretation, the idea that we are enabled by critical realism and justified by critical realism to look at values, ideologies, the behaviours like manipulation, and consider them as real structures, as things that have causal mechanisms, that we don't have to be objective, that we don't have to think of facts and values as being two separate entities, but in fact are connected. I think that does open up the capacity of social research. So I'm a sociologist as well, but more broadly in social research, it opens up a real justification for why we need to be considering those big ideologies like neoliberalism, for example, and all its mechanisms through marketization and the way that politics works when we consider the social problems in the world. And the fact that critical realism allows us to, and Margaret Archer's work so beautifully gives us analytical frameworks for thinking about those different kinds of social structures, cultural structures, and how individuals negotiate and change those things over time. I think that's so clear in that illustration of her work. So I don't know if I've made that very clear, but there's a couple of things there. It's the structured nature of reality that enables this kind of analysis, but also the almost compulsory needing to actually look to ideology and look to values and consider them as having real powers that need to be part of our research, part of our analysis, and analysed as causes, or having causal powers.
Thank you, Catherine. I was struck by your calling out that in many jurisdictions, schools are being converted to factories, essentially, with the resultant moral impacts on teachers. Of course, we've seen this all in the Industrial Revolution, and now it's in schools. But to your point on the researchability of values and ideologies, I think that's a real advance that CR gives us. I wanted to ask Tony an important question to me on how empirical research will be done using the frameworks of Archer. So what guidance would you give to a researcher who is adopting this approach to social systems research in terms of the empirical aspect? Because the reality is that, so I believe the skill set to execute this kind of research has to be really extensive, going through historical documents, narratives, public documents, and also doing interviews, etc. Any tips, Tony, for the aspiring critical realist social researchers?
I think policy documents are not possible to avoid. I mean, it's a central type of documents that you have to study. You know, what kind of political decisions are made at the central level. And if it's true that that actually the international organizations are requiring centralization in the name of decentralization, then it's well, that could be documented, I suppose, and all kinds of correspondences between the international aid, the donors, if there are any, and the requirements they make for giving their money or loans. I suppose that is very important documents. And of course, some people study newspaper campaigns, and how is education covered in the news, like the PISA tests and all that. It's a vast number of articles written about how PISA has been used to scandalize educational systems in various countries and has caused all kinds of political movements, more or less relevant to the issues raised. So I suppose, I mean, there are very many things you can use the empirical data, but you just got to make clear what kind of research questions you have, because of course there are a number of issues you can raise in this kind of research.
Thank you, Tony.
Just keeping in mind that the system is there normally. However it is, probably you should find out what kind of system you have quite at an early stage.
Thank you, Tony. Yes, policy documents, and of course, most countries have a Freedom of Information Act, and citizens can ask for public, even minutes of meetings. In the Philippines, just for the information of everyone, we do not have a Freedom of Information law in place. I think it's failed to pass already in 6 Congresses, so we're still waiting. I'm not holding my breath, but I'm also struck by how Varoufakis claimed that he recorded his meetings with, Lagarde and the others in the Troika, and he used that for his memoirs. So I think everybody. What are your views on recording discussions with politicians, Tony? Is that something that can be used?
Recording discussions?
Policy discussions.
Among politicians?
Well, in the case of Greece, they were trying to renegotiate their debt, if you will remember.
Yes.
And publicly, he claims, IMF was claiming, and of course, also the Germans were claiming that they were interested in helping Greece. But the position of Varoufakis was precisely, it was the multilaterals and including Germany that pushed Greece to adopt more and more debt, but was now, not helping them out of that debt issue. And what he did was during the meetings, he claimed in his book that he would turn on his phone and record the goings on. And that is what he used in his book to say that actually IMF was doing the very opposite of what they were claiming. And they said so in the meetings. Of course, I can imagine this would be a very explosive kind of thing that maybe we're used to seeing this more from investigative journalists, but socials, because when we're dealing with power issues, there's polite data and data that will probably be quite, controversial. What are your thoughts on that? Like recording meetings?
No, I don't think you can do that unless you have the permission. I think as a researcher, you have a certain code of ethics that you have to follow when you collect your data. You may be critical of the people you interview, but you cannot sort of cheat them as giving data to your research. You have to follow certain ethical rules. You have to get an agreement to tape people, for instance. You have to ask for the permission.
Yes, I think our ethics review board will agree with you. Which is, ironically, which is why a lot of socials...
Excuse me.
Yes, is this Ito?
Excuse me, yes, Ito. There's a
Yes?
question from Ravinata. Ravinata, please, has a question.
Yes. I was just completing my point that
Yes,
this aspect of using data for empirical research, well, because sociologists are academics, so they're bound by ethics review boards, etc. But investigative journalists have some leeway in using recorded evidence to expose flaws in systems, especially oppressive systems, right? So that's why I thought I'd ask this question. And Tony gave the perspective that we in universities take, that we are covered by research code of ethics. The comment you're pointing out, Ito, is by whom? Is it Is it Gilsu?
Ravinata.
Ravinata Journal. I think this is the author.
We have been off screen because the signal is weak when I'm there. My question, thank you very much for this wonderful 2 days, deeply appreciated. I'm looking at the trying to use critical realism in understanding the dynamics of the Human Rights Council as both a multilateral institution and also where non-state actors are able to have considerable opportunity to influence, although it is eventually states who act. My 2 questions was first to Tony, how she sees the extension from the World Bank, IMF side of things to, I know Keck and Sikking have looked at human rights, but not in critical realist framework. I was wondering whether you might have some comment about how you might extend what you are talking about to also cover the human rights related institutions through a critical realist frame. And the second one, and thank you very much, Gil, Suhan, for sending me about a paper, but I find not much written from a CR perspective on foreign policy and IR. And I was wondering whether any of you might be able to refer me to something. I've been told that there was a IR related topic 7 to 10 years ago. I looked at the journal, but I haven't come across it. If anyone can refer me to it, I'd appreciate it. Thank you very much once again for putting this together.
Thank you, Rabinat. Tony, did you want to comment on that? He was interested in human rights councils in relation to the international bodies.
I think it's a bit difficult for me to comment on that.
Mm.
I'm not prepared.
Yeah, noted. Rabinat, were you asking about references in international relations?
Yes, IR and foreign policy decision making, kind of. That's what I'm focusing.
Have you looked up Heikki Patomäki? I think
yes, I have. Yes,
yeah. So
have.
I think I don't know who else worked after him. I don't think anyone else has taken the torch after him. What did your literature search show?
There is some work done on Turkish foreign policy.
Ah, there you go.
And they have also, but Patomäki is, I think, the one who has gone more deeper into it. But unfortunately, you don't find much.
Yes.
Which deals with the complexity of the state and the NGOs, the non-state and state actor, and I've just been wondering whether trying to understand underlying mechanisms at play might be of some use in this regard.
I believe you're right, but I also don't notice a lot of work in that area because I've also been monitoring that area. So I think that's your calling, Rabinat. So good luck.
Does the speaker have any extrapolation from what she's been talking about in relation to World Bank, IMF, even in a general sense in looking at the human rights institutions?
I think Tony is taking a prudent stance on this and not, commenting because it is beyond her scope.
Okay.
But thank you for raising that, Rabinat.
Okay.
All right. So I think at this point, we'd like to thank Tony for giving us a friendly backgrounder on Archer. I think I'm going to pick up my old Archer book again. Thank you, Tony. And if you can, of course, he was also active in the Council for Catholic Social Science, right? I think she was one of the leading lights in the Catholic Social Science Council. Although I don't know if she's active now. So at this stage, I'd like to go to my presentation. So allow me to just share my slides here. And my area of research is in management and business. And I'm going to take a first-person crack at this, meaning my own ongoing research is what I would share, but also in the context of what we are trying to do in business education in our university. Is everybody able to see my presentation? Okay, thank you. So I've titled this as Faculty-Led Institutional Entrepreneurship for Inclusive Business Practice. And we take this from a critical realist action research perspective. All right, so here I'm showing the picture of Kurt Lewin, who is acknowledged as the founder of action research. And this is one of his famous quips. There's nothing so practical as a good theory, because for him, theory should emerge from actual practice. So I think a good link to critical realism is that in the way that Bhaskar started his transcendental argument by looking at how scientists perform natural experiments, we can look at action research really as social experiments, where change is initiated by actual intervention in a social system so that we are able to learn whether our theory about that system and the way to change it is correct. So that's why he calls it a practical theory, because it's a theory born out of social experiment. So here are some descriptions of action research. It seeks to bring together action and reflection. So that means meta-reflexive data is also part of the data that action research deals with, not just the empirical data that is observable or measurable outside the realm of the actors, but even their own thoughts. Theory and practice in participation with others. So action research emphasizes collaboration in the pursuit of practical solutions to issues of pressing concern. And the research and the subject are both engaged. So this is one of the more controversial features of action research, because it throws the assumption, or rather the requirement in positivist research, that the researcher and the object of research should be separate, that the researcher should be detached, because that is the only way to assure objectivity, etc. But in action research, the action researcher is precisely engaged in the social situation that he or she is trying to understand. In fact, they are jointly responsible for developing and evaluating the theory or the knowledge that is part of what is being studied. And they are to reflect on that knowledge through that process, and thereby use that to help improve the social situation. So instead of viewing relevance and rigor as a dilemma, because these are always being pitted against each other, action research says that they're actually both part of the same quality criterion. Only relevant research can be rigorous, and only rigorous research can be relevant. And there's this flavor of action research called critical participatory action research. And the link to critical realism is what we call explanatory critique. And in explanatory critique, the way I understand Bhaskar is he's saying that if a researcher understands that a system is oppressive, and he understands why the system persists, then it is his duty to either mitigate the oppressive features of the system, or at least share knowledge about it so that people can transform that system. And this type of action research expresses a commitment to this kind of social analysis. So it's self-reflective, but it's more importantly transformational. So this goes back to the original Marxist tenet, right? It's not just to understand systems, but to change it. So here, specifically, Chemis argues that when we expose the nature of these empowering features of industrial society, etc., we can now propose more just systems, because these systems pervade because people don't pay attention to them or take them for granted. In the way we approach action research in the Graduate School of Business at De La Salle, we expose them to this model of looking at a situation, looking at its context and purpose. Let's say it's a business situation, or an industry-wide situation, or even a country-wide situation, and then to go through 3 phases roughly in an iterative way. Construction, meaning collaborators try to understand what is affecting the system, what is the issue that we are experiencing in the system, and then based on that understanding of the system, to plan action together, to take action, and then to evaluate whether our action is having the intended effect, and if not, why so, and going through that cycle again. So action research is therefore iterative in the sense that you're working on a system to try to influence it to move towards a more empowering state, or at the minimum, a less oppressive state. And in each cycle, you're refining your knowledge of the system, as well as your knowledge of the impact of your interventions, and even your knowledge of yourselves as actors, whether you're influenced by ideology, or whether your particular socially situated context affects how you approach a system, etc. Okay, so my research questions, which I've been regularly engaged with, is the following. What is the role of a business academic in social change? Because many business academics, those who teach in MBA programs, normally take the role to be transmitting a certain received body of knowledge. So in the Philippines, for example, 99.9% of what we teach our students are from Western authors, well, notably American authors. So we are the mouthpiece. I always call ourselves the mouthpiece of Western authors, and we regurgitate this to our students. But I've always been uncomfortable about that because in the first place, many of these frameworks were developed by American business scholars who have never even visited the Philippines, much less thought about the struggles of Filipinos in trying to achieve human development, etc. And yet we mass disseminate these frameworks. So the question is, if I were an academic and I wanted to promote business knowledge that is more relevant to our aspirations as a country, what would be my role there? And how can theory guide us in reforming our business education system so that we are able to help our business students become more positive change agents in society? And what is the role of professional associations? I think, yeah, Archer would often call these as corporate agents, those who act together for a particular interest. And how can this be used to influence the way business is being taught? In our country, well, this is before the pandemic, we were having quite healthy growth in our economy, averaging about 6 to 7%. But this is a standard feature of Philippine so-called quote-unquote development. So you have the skyline there, you know, skyscrapers popping out. But the people who help maintain these buildings live in squalor like this. So maybe messengers or delivery people, even secretaries and security guards that help manage these buildings and businesses go home to houses like this. So even our Economic Development Authority always point this out, that there is robust growth, but income inequality is widening. Of course, when the pandemic hit, this almost doubled, the inequality doubled. And it's been pointed out by even the business press that we have one of the slowest rate of poverty reduction in this part of the world. So you see Thailand and Malaysia reducing their poverty even during the early 2000s, and Vietnam now reducing its poverty quite quickly, but the Philippines kind of plods along at this very slow rate. And even the World Bank has pointed out that in the Philippines, even many of the employed remain poor. So there are jobs being created, but they are very low quality jobs, so that often Filipinos have to juggle 2 jobs or do some side income earning projects just to make ends meet. Which only shows that employment figures hide more than they show, right? Because they don't actually show the quality of jobs. They just show whether people found a job. And in fact, the way government defines employment is if you had a job in the past 6 months, even if you just work for a week or even a day, you're considered employed, which is really funny. But this is standard practice. So what we try to do in the business school is we align ourselves with the challenges posed by the UN. In particular, SDG Goal 1 and 8, which is about eliminating poverty and ensuring that economic growth provides decent work. It is not growth for its own sake. It's not growth because it looks good in a GNP or GDP figure, but it's growth that is actually felt by human beings as they achieve their dreams in life. I think Archer makes a very strong point about mobility and how people try to move in the system so that they can become better fulfilled. And this is where action research helps us to apply this concept. In particular, I found it helpful to use this system by Mumford and Anjum. They're not critical realists, but they are aligned with the tendency school of thought of causality. And they developed this vector model where in a system, there are multiple forces, which is also same in critical realism, right? But for a system to move towards a certain direction, the sum of forces moving towards that direction must, in a way, overwhelm the forces against that move. And they use this rough physics-like, depiction of these forces. And then when a system is stable, the only way to move the system towards a direction is either to eliminate forces that are pushing it away, or add forces that will move it towards that direction. So what we've done is we look at why in the Philippines there is so much non-inclusivity, meaning there's so much economic growth, but the poverty doesn't diminish in any way. So I was, as a critical realist academic, the way I tried to deal with this was to analyze what's going on. So I identified some hypotheses that, you know, we want to move in this direction where inclusive business practice would be the norm. But we are currently in this situation. So I looked at certain factors that I believe affect the situation. Certain cultural propositions. The number one is that the duty of business is profit. And here we are complicit as business schools. If you ask students in any of our classes, what is the purpose of business, they will all raise their hands and say it's profit. So in a way, we program them to think this way. Because the economics courses start with microeconomics, of course, then they run the full course of micro, and then they have the profit maximizing model, etc. So it's kind of programmed into that. So social duty belongs to government and personal advocates. So that means businesses have no social duty except the duty to produce profits for its shareholders. And then there are also social structures, the relationship of controlling shareholders with employees. So this is part of the corporate situation in the Philippines, where employees see themselves as beholden to those who have equity and who give them jobs, quote unquote. Therefore, they have, yeah, I would say this relates to an almost semi-feudal kind of relationship. And then, of course, our top business leaders are very, very closely associated with the leaders of the state. In fact, many of our top executives end up taking cabinet-level positions in the government. And then once that a government ends its term, that same executive will go back to the company. And some would say that is a highly conflicted situation, right? Because you are at the same time the business leader, and then you become a government leader, and then it's kind of like, they call it like a turnstile approach. You know, people go in and out. But the challenge there is, how do you ensure that the state really takes care of everyone and not just the interests of the top business groups? So this is a structural issue in my view. And then, of course, there are cultural propositions, or what Archer calls intelligibilia, right? There are ideas floating around, notions that corporate owners deserve most of the gains. After all, they put in the capital, so that means they absorb most of the risk. In this discourse, employees who, you know, commute every day and who give their work to the objective of the company somehow are not putting in as much risk as equity owners, which is part of the discourse of capitalism, right? That equity owners carry the risk. But in truth, we see that employees carry risk as well, because they can lose jobs, they can even get sick just going to work. During the pandemic, they experienced that. But there are some positive forces as well. Some business leaders are becoming more reflexive about what's happening. There are global advocacies. There are now ways, well, the global advocacies a lot of these come from the multilaterals. In fact, like even the World Bank is pushing for inclusive business, which is, in fact, the thrust of the World Bank now is business should focus on the bottom 40% and uplift that. They call it shared prosperity. And there are also regulations from the Securities and Exchange Commission from various governments saying that publicly listed companies should be thinking of stakeholders, not just shareholders. And the actual research comes here in terms of advocacy and curriculum reform. So for me as an academic, what I tried to do was to join professional associations, and I did this over a period of 12 years, and saw what I could do to advocate. Now this was a challenge for me because business leaders are not used to interacting with academics within business associations. But somehow I managed to stay on and somehow got into contact with some business leaders who also feel that business has a broader role rather than just profit. And then what we did was also to reform our MBA curriculum. And because of this, we were able to successfully, but this is over a period of almost initially 5 years and then 10 years, we were able to convince the Securities and Exchange Commission to make the goal of the Code of Corporate Governance more stakeholder oriented, because there was a strong lobby from the business groups to say that the Code of Corporate Governance should just say that the boards should be responsible for the stockholders. So essentially the government is saying, the business leaders are saying, the corporation has to think of the stockholders because the government is already thinking of all the stakeholders. What do they mean? For example, we have labor laws. So labor laws are supposed to protect the employees. And then we have consumer protection laws. And therefore that should take care of the customers. And then there are environmental laws. So that should take care of the environment, etc., etc. So which means that since everybody's taken care of, who's taking care of the shareholders? Then the business should take care of the shareholders. And so this argument is very popular in our country. But there are many, an increasing number of business leaders who are already speaking out that this does not make sense. Because in the first place, the justice system and the enforcement institutions are extremely weak. So even if you have labor laws, the probability that a low-level worker will file a suit against a major Philippine corporation is close to zero. He would not have the legal resources. The free lawyer from the government will not put up a very convincing case against the expensive law firms that corporations routinely retain. So, and the same is true with all other stakeholders. These business organizations are just so huge that the power is overwhelming. So because of weak institutions, therefore, there is a need for business leaders themselves to think of the stakeholders when they make decisions. So this kind of analysis sort of gave me the idea that action researchers can do this when they analyze systems. And one of the, okay, I just wanted to show a final slide before the questions. This part, okay. So part of what we did, and this is really the output of our collaboration with the business associations, two business associations actually, the Management Association of the Philippines and the Shareholders Association of the Philippines. This is the outcome. In 2017, the Securities and Exchange Commission issued the Code of Corporate Governance and stated Principle 16. The company should be socially responsible in all its dealings with the communities where it operates. This was considered a landmark advance because the 26 business organizations supported this move. And we kind of went on a, how do we say this? A roadshow to explain this to the media. And here you see me trying to explain this to a morning talk show host for business, why this was so important. And this happened as I spoke on this as the pandemic was, rampaging through our country. And this is where we were quite pleasantly surprised that many of the businesses actually, were very generous. They, even when they were on lockdown and people were not reporting, they were paying out employees, and they were able, therefore, to really provide bridging, support, or because we don't have very effective employment insurance in the Philippines. So the company sort of filled in that gap. Post-pandemic, the lessons of the pandemic would be retained in our system. That is that businesses cannot think of stakeholders as separate from themselves, but that they are really in solidarity with each other because they need each other, basically. So even if you're, let's say, a mall owner, one of our leading companies here has 80 malls, and that's just one company, which is interesting because for a country wrapped in poverty, you have so many malls, which means that citizens enjoy spending in malls. However, since many of them are not able to make ends meet, they become buried in debt, credit card debt, loan shark debt, all sorts of debt. And the businesses that run these malls, many of them actually during the pandemic went out of their way to really support a lot of the employees. Because they realized that how can you run malls if people don't have money to buy, right? So really, this is the point of solidarity, that an economy only makes sense if no one is, literally no one is left behind. So this is an example of what I thought I learned from this, in the sense that if we look back at the configuration here, theoretically, therefore, we can see that certain social situations in business can persist because of very strong cultural mindsets and social structures. But action is possible, but this needs reflexivity. And Archer makes a very strong case for how, the mediating role of reflexivity. Action researchers really reflect on their situation in social structures and their role to address oppressive features of that structure. Which is why at the beginning I said that one of my motivating argument really is explanatory critique, as explained by Archer. In fact, I was suggesting to Father Johnny if we can make a presentation, because he makes such excellent YouTubes, if we can explain explanatory critique to our publics. So I'll open the floor to questions now for those. Oh, I think I see some questions already in the chat. And of course, you may also, Ito, if you can just help me spot those hands. I seem to be missing those hands. Okay, so which question do we tackle first? Okay, Catherine was referring to conjunctional causality.
I really was just following on from a comment earlier, or question/comment by Patch a little bit earlier up in the chat.
Yes, I see that.
Thinking about the diagrams.
So maybe I could ask my questions, Dr. Ben?
Oh, please, Patch, go ahead.
Okay. So I was also reflecting on how we're applying force field analysis for our action research program. And one of the struggles I think that I observed from action researchers doing the action, not yet making sense of their experiences, is they struggle grounding their identification of relevant forces. So maybe it's because since they're very near the actual action that they're doing, it's hard to take a step back and think about what other forces should be considered. So I'm reflecting, how can we facilitate a better articulation of enabling forces and restraining forces, maybe with the context of the critical realist ontology. So I'm thinking, when we try to identify restraining forces or enabling forces, should we articulate it explicitly in terms of entities exerting causal powers, be it on the enabling side or the restraining side? Or should we articulate forces in terms of events or demi-regular trends? So I'm also reflecting on what a more useful or practical articulation of forces would be. So I'd like to know your thoughts about this question, Dr. Thank you.
Yes, well, I think all of those come into play, Patch, because when you're understanding an open system, obviously multiple causality will be at play. We can look at them irregularities as empirical signs that something is going on, right? We can put them there, but then always asking ourselves, but what is the mechanism that brings this about? For example, I show the graph of the rate at which the poverty of our neighboring countries have been plunging while ours remain relatively constant, even though our growth has been spectacular. Well, the math is simple because the growth went to very few families, right? In fact, even NEDA said that 70% of economic growth in the Philippines was going to the top 40 families. That doesn't even include all the offshore accounts, the Panama and all of this. So there are serious structural issues there. The laws favor them. There is a lack of voice for those who don't understand the corporate system or the regulatory system. And then there are also events. Like, for example, when the SEC removed the stakeholder from the policy statement, which is why I wrote them, why did you remove this? Because in 2002, the Securities and Exchange Commission already released the policy that the boards should think of the stockholders and other stakeholders. But in 2009, they removed that. That was an event, obviously, but that has an impact because it sends a message. The message is, okay, we're covered. Let government worry about stakeholders as long as we do right by our shareholders, we're covered. So as we know, Patch, no diagram, no narrative can fully capture a system. We're just doing the best we can. And I think that's the next thing we need to do is look at the theoretical papers that address some of these kinds of structures. For example, how does policy affect practice? For example, I attended some of those open forums on the Code of Corporate Governance because that's required by law, right? That before they promulgate the law, there should have been consultation. And I looked at the people who were attending, they were all corporate lawyers. So I was asking the Securities and Exchange Commission, where are the labor leaders? Where are the environmental groups? Apparently, in their view, when they consult stakeholders for a corporate law, the only stakeholders are the corporations themselves. And so this was really funny in my view, but I think they earnestly thought that that was the right thing. So even the way our public, our bureaucrats are trained, we need to look into that. What really is the duty of a public servant? And of course, corporate lawyers and lobbying, all of this is, as you know, very well funded. So I think all of those things have to come to play. And the challenge of the researcher really is assigning weights, maybe, and then doing the experiment. So when you do the experiment, you kind of glean how the causalities now interplay. And then hopefully from that murky understanding, some clarity will emerge. And then knowing that even then the social reality is changing it's like you're taking a movie of a changing project, right? So once the theory is out, the reality has changed already. That's the thing with social systems. So, and I know that this is one of the reasons why our students can be discouraged about action research. They would prefer to do the standard null hypothesis testing studies so that they can churn out the studies. And as long as your p-value is less than 0.05, you go around merrily saying, oh, I produce knowledge. But the question we always ask as critical realists is that, yes, you have the statistical result. The question is, what does it mean, right? Why is it happening? And there we really need theoretical input as well as our imagination, human imagination. So I hope that gives you some inputs for your own reflections, Patch.
Yes, sir. Yes.
All right. Are there other questions from our participants, or even your own sharing of your own role as academics, as advocates? Because that's really one of the core issues I've been dealing with as an action researcher. Whether as academics, do we just teach, or are we also agents of change? At this point, well, we don't have to exhaust our time if there are no questions.
Okay, if there are no more questions, I'd just like to thank our two resource speakers today. Tony for her presentation of her research on educational systems using the concepts of Archer, and of course Ben also with the exemplar of an action research using the conceptual tools of critical realism. Okay, so thank you. Let's give both of them a round of virtual applause by choosing the right emoji. Okay, and also at this point, I just like to once again just inform people that the recording of this session, just like yesterday's session, will be available on the website of the Asia Pacific Critical Realist Network. And this is the link. So for now, we have yesterday's recording and slides. By tomorrow, we will have Tony's slides and also Ben's slides, as well as the recording for this session. At the same time, I would like to just say that we will be sending out an email to each one of you to get your feedback about this first attempt of coming together to do a study, a study circle on critical realism. Your feedback and your suggestions will be very helpful to help us, conceptualize and plan the next event, the next activity for our network here. So I'd like just to thank all of you for joining us, and I'd like to invite you to just open your camera so that we can have a group picture, if that's okay. So if you want to switch to gallery view so we can see people, let's fix our hair the way Mingyu is fixing his hair. So we will all look handsome and pretty, and I hope this will be the beginning of great, a more active participation and involvement in our network. And we are very open to suggestions. So please feel free to give us your suggestions when we send you the email. Okay. So let's just wait a bit for the others. If some of them may be camera shy, but okay. So I'll just take one picture. I think we'll all fit. So everybody smile, please. Flash your biggest, widest critical realist smile, whether that's original basic or meta real. Okay, so thank you everyone. Special thanks to our lead facilitators, to Mingyu yesterday, to Tony and to Ben, also to Ito Jimenez, who's behind the scene working on everything. But most of all, thank you to all of you for your great participation. As Ben said earlier, the discussions have really been very rich. So thank you very much, and take care, everyone. You'll hear from us soon.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Salamat. Thank you.